Hello, good afternoon. It's with great pleasure that I welcome you to this webinar co-hosted by the Migration Policy Center at the EUI and the Comparative Network on Refugee Externalization Policies, CONREP. CONREP is a Jean Monnet Erasmus Plus network between 6 universities in Australia and Europe, headed by Professor Philomena Murray from the University of Melbourne. The network was established in 2018 and studies from a comparative perspective the impact and the effects of refugee externalization policies in 2 regions, Australia in Southeast Asia and the Pacific region, and the European Union and its member states in North Africa and the Middle East. Today we are thrilled to have 3 experts of asylum and migration policies who know very well both the EU, but also the countries targeted by refugee externalization policies in North Africa and the Middle East. And we also have the perspective from the international refugee regime through Madeleine Garlick, who works for the refugee agency UNHCR. Our speakers have been invited to share with us insights on the effects of refugee externalization policies on the target countries, which they know best, and on international institutions, and to reflect on how far these policies dilute or diffuse international norms on refugee protection. We have planned the seminar as follows. We have first 3 short presentations by the 3 speakers, which will be followed by a panel discussion before we open up to the Q&A. And please feel free to use the chat function on YouTube so that we can collect and bundle the questions that we receive. Without further ado, I am thrilled to introduce our 3 experts. The first speaker is Tamiras Fakouri. Tamiras is Associate Professor of Political Science and Global Refugee and Migration Studies at the Global Refugee Studies Research Group at Aalborg University, Copenhagen. And she's also Scientific Advisor to the Kuwait Chair at Sciences Po Paris. Until recently, she was Associated Professor at the Lebanese American University in Beirut and is an eminent expert of the politics of the Middle East, as well as migration and refugee policy in the region. Today, Tamiras will share her insights on the effects of EU refugee externalization policies on Lebanon and Jordan. Our second speaker is Federica Infantino. Federica is Marie Sklodowska-Curie Fellow at the MPC of the EUI. And she is an eminent expert of migration and border control policies in EU neighborhood countries. Today she will speak about the situation in Morocco, where she has studied the diffusion of practices in the day-to-day implementation of public policies by state and non-state actors in the fields of migration and refugees. Our third speaker, we are very honored to welcome also Madeleine Garlick on board from the UNHCR. Madeleine is Chief of the Protection Policy and Legal Advice section in UNHCR's Division of International Protection. And she has also always kept close connections with academia, amongst others with Sciences Po, where she's regularly teaching on refugee issues. We look very much forward to hearing how UNHCR observes the EU's outreach to countries of first asylum and countries of transit in its external migration and refugee policies, and how you perceive the balance between norm dilution and norm diffusion from the perspective of the global refugee regime. So without further ado, I will hand over to Tamiras Fakouri, who will start with a presentation on the situation in the Middle East and more specifically Lebanon and Jordan.
Thank you so much, Sandra. I'm delighted to be here, and I look forward to our discussion later on. So my contribution, as Sandra highlighted, will draw on the case study of displacement from Syria since 2011, More specifically, I'm going to explore how the EU has sought to externalize refugee policies beyond its territory and to create a so-called regional refugee management system in Syria's neighboring host countries. At the same time, I go beyond the analytical focus on externalization, and I explore how regional refugee hosting states that have received displaced from Syria have sought to reshape and reconfigure the EU's refugee externalization strategies, thereby exploring the push and pull dynamics between the EU and its neighbors. So given time limitations, I will only give some examples of how Lebanon and Jordan have sought to exploit and contest the EU's externalization mechanisms. So in doing so, and by unpacking the interactions between Lebanon and Jordan as regional host countries on the one hand, and the EU as an external actor in refugee governance on the other, I hope to derive broader implications or conclusions on how refugee norms travel and to touch on broader questions at the heart of responsibility sharing and protection standards. So as many of us know, in the rather very broad literature on externalization, the EU has provided one of the key cases for understanding how external actors may draw on migration control to create spaces of inclusion and exclusion in their near abroad. So in the Middle East and North Africa specifically, the EU's externalization agenda is to be historically understood in the context of weak regionalism in the region, but also in the EU's interest in migration control as geopolitical ordering and reordering. So in the sense, the EU has sought to shape the region not only through border work, but also what I'm interested in is the kind of narratives of governance that the EU diffuses in order to promote solutions around which states can converge, especially in asylum and refugee matters. So just to lay the ground briefly, EU external policy in the Middle East and North Africa has been mainly defined through the regional Barcelona process, which is a multilateral framework institutionalizing cooperation around trade, democracy assistance, migration, and security. Furthermore, the EU has relied through the European Neighbourhood Policy on bilateral cooperation with its southern neighbours as a key vector for externalizing migration control. Here, what comes to mind, of course, are bilateral mobility partnerships which twin visa liberalization regimes with curbing irregular migration. So at the same time, what is of interest to our discussion today is that the EU's ability to kind of, draw on its migration policy as an issue of external governance has had double-edged consequences. So various factors are at play here. For instance, countries such as Lebanon, Tunisia, Morocco, Libya, and Turkey have not been passive implementers of the EU's external action. Rather, they have disputed readmission and refugee deals and proposals that the EU had prepared. Also, most importantly, the diversity and fuzziness of migration and asylum regimes and subsystems within the Middle East and North Africa has made it exceedingly difficult for the EU to shape the geopolitics of the region through its external action. As some scholars argue today, these attempts have in fact become illusory, especially in the aftermath of the Arab uprisings, where the EU has admitted the limitations of its norm exporting projects. Of course, the current debate on the dying Barcelona process reflects such limitations. So I will turn now to my case study. So in the wake of mass displacement from Syria, as many of you know, the EU has promoted the script of resilience building as a guiding regional narrative for cooperating with partner governments such as Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, Egypt, and Iraq on the refugee challenge. So this approach seeks to build these countries' capacity to respond to the refugee challenge while boosting refugees' self-reliance and at the same time improving their access to livelihoods and protection. So case in point, of course, are the 2016 Lebanon and Jordan compacts, which were first celebrated as innovative examples that could lock in beneficial effects to both host and refugee communities. So in a nutshell, those compacts allocate financial aid with a view to boosting job creation, economic opportunities, and institutional stabilization in exchange for both Jordanian and Lebanese governments easing Syrian refugees' access to legal residency and to the labor market. So while the Lebanon Compact has really remained very vague in terms of refugee integration, the Jordan Compact eases Jordan's export requirements to the EU in return for Jordan providing employment quotas and job permits for Syrian refugees. Both compacts, however, seek to create incentives for catalyzing asylum reforms from beyond or beyond the EU's territory. Following up on them, the EU has consolidated mainly through the lens of the 4 Brussels conferences that it has co-hosted since 2016, 17, apologies, its efforts in building the capacity of local asylum systems. So examples include facilitating refugees' access to residency, education, employment, and protecting them against forced returns. So at first glance, really, these instruments seem like an excellent attempt to create options or solutions for displaced individuals and to prevent rash refugee returns or onward secondary journeys. The compacts remain, however, disconnected from the creation of sustainable legal remedies for refugees. And ultimately, as many practitioners and scholars have demonstrated, they feed into the broader logic of temporariness and transitoriness, i.e. that refugees, and here I quote from Elizabeth Ferris, will remain where they are in conditions short of full local integration, and that somehow they will get by. So we know for a fact now that 5 years after their adoption, the compacts have had little transformative effect on the ground. Practically, I would go as far as arguing in this seminar that they have paradoxically reached non-resilient outcomes. So Lebanon here arises as a case in point. Indeed, in the light of Lebanon's cascading crises, ranging from the financial collapse to the Beirut blasts, it's safe to say that the EU's resilience building vision, so as a guiding external refugee policy narrative, has reached somehow a dead end. So more than 70% of Syrian refugees today have been thrown under the poverty line, and only 20% of them have legal residency despite the UNHCR's and the EU's efforts. So in Jordan, although the scenario is not as grim and not as dark, though many Syrian refugees have gotten job permits, these job permits are not to be confused with decent and dignifying work that could pave the way for sustainable legal remedies and also options for the future. So in addition to formalizing refugee precarity, what I would like to argue here is that these resilience package deals have further provided an opportunity for partner governments to leverage and contest such policy tools in the framework of asymmetrical power differentials, further diluting norms on refugee protection, and most importantly, eroding the EU's capacity to position itself as a rights-based actor in asylum and refugee affairs beyond its borders. So to illustrate such push and pull dynamics and explore their consequences on the refugee protection, I will give some limited examples, only very briefly, that are based on my field research and on a survey of existing literature. So Syria's neighboring countries have acquired a twin capacity to instrumentalize and contest the EU's project of resilience building. So in terms of leverage, both Lebanon and Jordan have drawn on the EU's need to contain the refugee challenge within the regional borders to lobby for more aid in a tacit acknowledgement that they could play the role of refugee gatekeepers. The danger, however, is that, you know, this leverage has gone without accountability and without transparency on the ground, you know, contributing to a backlash on refugee rights. Also, Jordan and Lebanon have contested or selectively implemented the EU's policy mechanisms in the absence of negative conditionalities, thus affecting how they are practically implemented and how they change people's lives. So the Lebanese government has heavily disputed the EU's search for lasting solutions where refugees are. And despite signing the compact in 2016, key political executives have reneged on the compact's commitments later. Also, Lebanese ministries have contested the EU's toolbox of so-called positive incentives that push for refugee integration. For instance, they were very reluctant, according to our research, to conclude a formal deal tying refugee employment with trade facilitation. So as you know, as most displaced Syrians are Sunni, Lebanese political parties have used the sectarian card, expressing the fear that their integration is going to upset or disturb the country's sectarian balance of power. Recently, what is interesting is that they have been asking the EU to shift its strategy from deploying financial aid where refugees are to their country of origin, i.e. Syria in this case, hence to promote rash returns, of course. So Jordanian policy makers have not rejected the EU's policy proposals as blatantly as their Lebanese counterparts have done. Because as we know, as a rentier economy, Jordan really thrives on these external revenues. However, a critical geopolitical reading of the situation allows us to deduce that Jordanian domestic policy practices have shaped to a great extent the outcomes of negotiated refugee deals. So I want to talk about the compact a little bit. When it comes to this refugee policy tool, the Hashemite kingdom has only introduced cosmetic changes, but has not really changed or altered any of the structural impediments that are obstructing Syrians' access to protection and to the labor market. In the last years, we know that the Jordanian monarchy has had a keen interest in containing rising societal tensions, especially after the protests in 2018. And the government has so far implemented refugee instruments in such a way as they do not upset business leaders' preferences. So in a nutshell, changes have been cosmetic. Here, it's further interesting to analyze how the EU's inward securitized refugee practices have further weakened its ability to catalyze asylum reforms beyond its borders, despite its substantial funding power in Lebanon and Jordan. So the EU member states have securitized the refugee issue within their own borders. My research shows that Lebanon have recurrently used this instance to argue that they have done their share and that they are doing even better than EU member states in hosting refugees. I guess speech acts that Lebanese and Jordanian policy makers have used are countless, but just as an illustrative example to justify its policies, Lebanon many times has argued that it has respected the Geneva Convention much more than many European states, although it is a non-signatory state. And in Jordan, as international actors have criticized cases of deportation, policymakers have referred to the European countries' own practices of readmission to deflect accountability in this regard. So I show in my research how such policy framings have provided a wider or a trans-scalar discursive field for neighboring governments to contest EU external practices, eroding thereby their effectiveness on the ground and the transformative potential they could have in their implementation. So beyond policy making spheres, and this is my last point, I would like to stress that contention has not been restricted to local policy-making circles, and this is very important. Grassroots spheres, including refugees themselves, have disputed the impact of these external refugee policies. In Jordan, what is very much under-researched is how the compact has stirred tensions between Syrian refugees and other forgotten migrant and refugee communities, including Egyptians, Palestinians, so on and so forth, because as we know, the asylum system in the Middle East and North Africa, is kind of a mixture or an assemblage of interlocking human networks. And so the compact in that regard has disregarded those local, multi-dimensional encounters of people together, I would argue. And further, amid Lebanon's collapse and refugee deteriorating conditions, the EU's narrative of resilience building has provoked fierce criticism. This has led some to argue, and I'm kind of like quoting here civil society activists and local academics, that through this approach, the EU acts as an external actor that has shifted responsibility, because we cannot know anymore how its own tools or its own financial power can actually practically transform people's lives or interact with partner governments' policies. So their impact has become very fuzzy and very blurred, and how to account for them, this is a big question. So I'm going to I reach here my concluding remarks. I just have some takeaways for our discussion. So my guiding question in this presentation really was, how do we account for the pathways of externalization, and how do we track their impact on people's daily lives? I hope here to raise some questions for our discussion. Some takeaways. In the rather overly broad debate on externalization, lately some scholars such as Nick Tan have recently called for avoiding the conceptual stretching of the term and focusing on its complexity on the ground. Also, scholars such as Maya Janmir and others have called for looking at how refugee norms travel not only from Europe to its neighborhood, but vice versa. So in this contribution, I have drawn on the case of the compacts in the context of displacement from Syria to examine the EU's externalization agenda as a contested dynamic. One of the takeaways that was really very much inspired by the conversations I've had with local actors in Jordan and Lebanon is that an understanding of the externalization of refugee policies and their consequences on the ground is far from being about charting or tracking their mechanisms or the mechanisms that drive external actors to deter or discourage the arrival of displaced individuals. Rather, this calls for a deeper inquiry into how external actors become practically embroiled in the internal migration architecture of the partner governments they wish to diffuse norms to. And this is actually the ironical outcome. So in this regard, we may also wish to factor in our discussion not only forward diffusion from the EU to other neighboring states, but also, as some scholars frame it, reverse diffusion, whereby partner governments claim on the EU's discourses and practices and contest them. Last but not least, also as I tried to show in this contribution, and this echoes with what Sandra said at the end, at the beginning, through the externalization of refugee policies and the ways they become enmeshed in local politics, it's very important for us also to account for the ways the EU's capacity as a so-called frontrunner in refugee protection is seriously questioned and undermined by partner governments and grassroots spheres. I will end here. Thank you so much, and I look forward to our discussion later.
Excellent. Many, many thanks, Tamiras, for this account of the situation in Lebanon and Jordan. You highlighted very strongly the geopolitics of this policy area that is now well moving, beyond refugee protection only, beyond the legal framework of protection, human rights aspects, the humanitarian aspects, into really questions of conflict and much more sensitive relations between countries. I take from your talk that you think that the policies that have been put in place by Jordan and Lebanon under the pressure from the EU or the incentives, let's say, are more cosmetic. You use this word several times, and they are conditional also. I think this conditionality is one aspect that travels across cases. If we think also of Turkey, that the governments actually know how to play the card of refugees when they have other issues to address in relations to the Europeans, which of course is then, you know, impacting on those who are the most vulnerable in this game, who are the refugees. I also would like to mention briefly your emphasis on how vulnerable the EU has become in all this, and that ironically, by shifting a burden of refugee protection, it is actually taking back responsibility for the whole stability of a region, right? So it's shifting responsibility for hosting refugees, but in return, it has to take on responsibility for a worsening situation in that region, where it has become more and more embroiled, as you said. So yes, much to think about. And now I would like to pass the word to Federica Infantino, who will talk about Morocco. I'm curious to see whether you find similar developments and where you localize the question of diffusion of refugee norms for the Moroccan case.
Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks for this invitation, and I'm very delighted to contribute to this debate with such distinguished speakers. I'm very happy that my contribution followed the lines of the previous one in what she was saying about how we have to take into account the perspective of these third states and not simply look at them as targets of EU externalization policies. So really, in this brief talk, I would like to use really a post-colonial perspective approach in international relations, and I would like to show how a weak actor like Morocco, weak in the sense of in the relationship with a more powerful partner, which is the EU, is not just a recipient, a target of these policies about migration and border control, but actually shape policies, and how Morocco has actually used this position to have certain outcomes, and how migration policy making in Morocco is highly affected by Moroccan capacity to use this link between foreign affairs and migration. So let me go into details, and I also aim at deconstructing some Europe-centered views about Morocco. First, the understanding of Morocco as a transit country. So this idea of transit, this idea has become mainstream, and it's strictly interrelated to the fact that Morocco is depicted as transit country, so that it can be involved in this objective of controlling migration movements towards the EU, as if all migration in Morocco is simply going towards the EU. From this matters because from the point of view of migrants who are in Morocco, it is something that affects their lives. And here I'm talking more of the populations of migrants coming from the southern countries of the Sahara. So in this idea of transit, this mainstream idea of seeing Morocco as a transit country means in practice that whoever Black person is seen as an undocumented migrant, also because here we are talking of refugees, but we know that in practice on the ground, the difference between undocumented migrants, refugees, asylum seekers is much more difficult to make. So there is an issue about racism, and although racism towards Black populations in Morocco has historical origins, so it's not completely connected to the EU externalization of border control. However, this externalization and the mainstream ideas of Morocco as a transit country reinforce racism. So this notion of transit, I mean, should be criticized because it hasn't historical depth. Mainly, it conceals the history of South-South migrations, ranging from the mobility of traders to the students, the migration of students going to Morocco that has origins in the South-South cooperation, but also migration linked to religious affairs. So rather than talking of migration transitions in Morocco and historical roots of South-South migration, migration tends to be seen only as a result of being on the route to reach Europe. Now, it is true that Morocco is on the route to Europe, and Morocco used this as what many scholars have called a geographical rent. Many studies also about the negotiations of readmission agreements show how Morocco has used this geographical position as a rent and has used that to link migration issues with economic issues. And so migration is Morocco is an active player that has used migration in obtaining other kinds of results. And has also developed what has been called a migration diplomacy. What is very important to understand what's happening about refugees and the migration policy making in Morocco, it's very important to understand that the foreign affairs issue, the linkages between foreign affairs issues and the use of migration is not only related to Europe, but to other African countries. And this has underlined an important policy shift in the domain of migration policy making. So in Morocco, migration policy design has been characterized by two major developments. A securitarian start that has led to the adoption of the law in 2003. This law marks the end of a laissez-faire attitude towards migration. And the law was extremely restrictive. So it's really seen as a diffusion from the EU. It criminalized irregular immigration and emigration, as well as its assistance. And so it really braked with the former rather lax attitude towards Morocco. More recent development started in 2013 with the campaign of regularization of undocumented foreigners, marked a shift towards Morocco recognizing itself as an immigration nation. And this was led by the king, yeah? Because here we are in a monarchy, so it's completely led by the king. In 2014, the government adopted a national strategy for immigration and asylum. So this is really a great development, which aimed at providing Morocco with the legal and institutional infrastructure to integrate migrants, refugees, it included the fact that foreigners can benefit from the same rights as those enjoyed by Moroccan citizens included labor, so they can be hired without being subject to the principle of national preference. So there are a series of measures on the integration, and this is very much connected with the refugees. And this broader reorientation is connected, has been connected by many scholars with a change in geopolitical culture towards the rest of Africa. So has nothing to do anymore with the EU. And this is interesting because this change that actually goes in the direction of EU objectives of burden sharing and responsibilities sharing is not actually led by the EU, but it's actually a more linked to foreign affairs interests towards the rest of Africa. So we have to remember that Morocco rejoined the African Union in 2017, and in a way, Morocco was getting rid of its reputation of the sheriff's deputy, which is actually what the externalization of border control does. And it erects buffer zones around the EU. So to get rid of this reputation and present itself under a different light vis-a-vis other African countries. On the international scene, the Moroccan migration diplomacy has been extremely successful. We can't forget that the global compacts are also known as the Marrakesh Pact. So this global compact will be always associated to Morocco. And this was a great success of Morocco, precisely because it was presenting itself as this country in between Europe and Africa, and capable of dealing no more in a violent and only restrictive understanding of migration, and also violent, because the international reputation of Morocco has been very bad for many years because of the violences at the border. The events in 2005 in Ceuta are always remembered, for instance. Now, okay, we talked about the policy design and all the negotiations, all these kind of levels, but what happens at the level of practice? How policies and ideas, or how these new policies, new ideas are translated on the ground? What are the effects on refugees' protection? Moroccan practices as well give us a clear idea of the linkage between migration control and foreign affairs issues, and how migration control might be used as a leverage for other issues. An example stems from recent events, what has recently happened in Ceuta. The leader of Polisario has secretly escaped to Spain to receive health treatments. Morocco responded to what it perceived as a wrong action from a country with whom Morocco cooperates, Spain, by suspending border policing at the Spanish enclave in Ceuta. So this is also a good example of the audience-directed nature of border control, which goes well beyond Morocco, of course. So this tells it's always important to look at the practice, and the practice is even very telling in all this. And when we look at the implementation of the new immigration policy, most notably the integration aspects that are related to the refugees, a series of issues have been identified, most importantly, the access to health services. So there are the policies, but then there are no budgets actually to ensure the access to health service beyond the basic ones. These open spaces to non-state actors, and this is another understanding of the term externalization, also to non-state actors. And the UNHCR plays a key role here, and especially if it it has a budget, for instance, for the healthcare of refugees. And on this, there is a forthcoming book by Lorena Gazzotti that really explains the implications of the transformation of Morocco into an immigration nation. So international donors and aid are still key elements in the implementation of migrants integration policies. From the point of view of practice, when we think of discrimination and violence towards especially Black populations, the violence and the discrimination diminished in the wake of the King announcements about the new immigration policy. But however, for instance, in 2016, local NGOs were describing violence at the borders with the Spanish enclaves. And we can probably, in the discussion, I can talk more about the labor market and how it continues to be difficult to access the labor market. So to conclude, this is just a short, brief contribution to say that while developments in migration and asylum policies in Morocco can be certainly put in relation with the externalization of EU border and migration control, it would be misleading just to see them as passive effects. And the rest of Africa should be included in the picture. And it is interesting to note how, however, these transformations go in the direction of EU objectives, and that the EU and international organizations still play a key role in the issue of migrants more broadly and refugee protection there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Federica. This was also extremely rich and eye-opening. One aspect that is special about Morocco is indeed this change that you highlighted from a repressive approach to a more human rights-based approach, and the introduction of some protection policies as well. Its global role for the global compacts concluded in Marrakesh. And you mentioned this is, the EU has nothing to do with it. This is Morocco's own self-orientation as a regional power in Africa. And a question that we should always have in mind, I think, when we talk about externalization and the EU's role, is that, of course, the EU has direct and indirect effects on these countries. Direct effects by the policies it officially targets towards these countries, indirectly because it becomes more restrictive internally. So many people basically get stuck in countries of transit or first countries of asylum. But there are also pressures on these countries that have nothing to do with the EU proper, that, as you said, come out of their own internal and international developments and positioning. And if we compare with how the refugee regime has developed in the Western liberal democracies in the 20th century, it was also often political considerations that have driven the expansion of the regime, and not, the human rights agenda per se. So this is a continuation of older templates, and insofar good news for the case of Morocco. But then the question is how sustainable will be this reorientation, and is it comparable? Does it lead to policy diffusion, in the sense that Morocco establishes a system of refugee protection that is comparable to what we know from Europe, or do we see a transformation of the way how refugees are hosted in these countries? Also linking back to Tamira's, her notion of cosmetic hosting, superficial, conditional, cosmetic hosting of refugee population. You mentioned, Federica, that non-state actors take an important role then in implementation, that we have certain provisions in the law, but then to put them in practice, it takes more, and it takes not only money, but also capacity and well, administrations, powers, institutions that will put it in place, and that then international actors play an important role, eventually also civil society actors. So I think these are many interesting questions to follow up with, and I'm very much looking forward to the UNHCR's and Madeline's perspective on these developments. What is due to the EU? What is, more inherent developments in these regions, and where does refugee protection come in? How far do we see also transformation of the norms of refugee protection? So I hand over to you, Madeline.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Can you hear me? All is well? Very good. Let me really thank the organizers today for the invitation to take part. It really is a pleasure and a privilege to be with such distinguished panelists and to have the opportunity to speak to you all. And I have to say, it's very interesting for me to be back focusing in particular on the European Union in this context. But as you've noted, Sandra, my role today is more global. And the externalization debate, I should say, is a very current one for UNHCR that's not limited in any sense either to the two regions that the CONREP focuses on, Europe and Asia. But we also see some trends that give us cause for concern and caution in other parts of the world, in the Americas and beyond. So it's truly a global debate that this topic needs to have. It's a current debate, but I should perhaps say also, I think it's not a new one. And UNHCR in recent days and weeks has actually pronounced itself quite vocally on this subject. And I will talk to you today a bit about the content and the background to some of those new pronouncements from UNHCR's side. But it's also comes against a background of many years during which UNHCR has been drawing lines and seeking to provide guidance on what is permissible and what is not in regards to states' cooperation and risks of externalization. Allow me perhaps to share my screen. I'll go through a few brief slides to frame the discussion. I hope that's visible now, and I will start the slideshow if I can get it to work. There we go. So let me then put on the screen the links to those new papers that we've just put out. Really, in the last few days, in fact, a note on externalization of international protection that's accompanied by a longer annex, which is looking at some of the categories of practices and policies which fall within the concept of externalization that I'll define for you in a minute from UNHCR's perspective. There's also a press release that was put out quoting our Assistant High Commissioner for Protection, Gillian Triggs, recently, really in response to some new proposals from Denmark in particular that have given us cause for concern, and on which UNHCR has recently issued detailed legal analysis and comments around the legislative proposal linked thereto. But as I said, these are not new issues that HCR is engaging with, and you have there on the screen, in fact, a number of other situations that we have commented upon over the years, which also bring out some concerning elements with this respect, dating back to Australian policies put in place after the Tampa incident in the early 2000s, debates in the EU that have focused on proposals from the UK, from Germany, also problematic practices with respect to Dublin, which of course have found their way into the major regional courts and have seen some very important standards put in place, affirmed by the European Court of Human Rights and the European Court of Justice, with UNHCR as a intervener in those leading cases, as well as analysis and jurisprudence on states' practices in international waters. With the case of Hirsi, of course, as a important judgment in that regard. We've also pronounced ourselves on the EU-Turkey statement of 2016, and I know at least one of the participants online here is interested and has posed a question about that. And also today, not only with regards to Denmark recently, but in the last 12 months, Hungary's new legislation regarding the obligation for some categories of people to undergo pre-screening at the border and efforts to forbid access to asylum to people unless they first apply at Hungary's embassies abroad. So really a vast array of challenging practices here with which we need to engage. So against this background, HCR's new paper, the two-pager that is now available on RefWorld, we have defined a concept of externalization that I have put there on the screen. Measures taken by states unilaterally or in cooperation with others, which are implemented or have effects outside their territories, which directly or indirectly prevent asylum seekers or refugees from reaching a particular destination country or preclude them from being able to claim and enjoy protection. And we underline that these measures constitute externalization where they involve inadequate safeguards to guarantee international protection or where they seek to shift responsibility for identifying or meeting international protection needs. Now, we've taken care to define this concept in our paper, and we think it's very important to be clear about the notion for at least three reasons. First of all, because of course externalization isn't a concept that exists in international law. It's not defined anywhere in international treaties or in any other widely accepted or authoritative document. The second reason it's important is because the term is used in many different settings and sometimes to refer to different things and not always in ways that necessarily further productive dialogue about what states need to be doing and what practices are permissible and are not. And thirdly, and crucially, we think it's important to define it because this is not a term that states use. And if we are going to take issue with certain types of practices and if we want to influence states' behaviors, we need to be extremely clear and accurate in what we're talking about in order to be able to engage in a meaningful dialogue that could have an influence on the practices of states. And I would also say thereby also regional actors such as the EU. So our paper, having defined externalization, then goes on to talk about some of the common features that we see that are problematic in this regard, that externalization arrangements can result in the transfer of people from one state to another without adequate protection safeguards to ensure standards of treatment in line with international law. These frequently lead to so-called warehousing of asylum seekers. This can be in remote places or in places otherwise where conditions are highly problematic. It can create a risk of direct or indirect refoulement, being return, of course, to persecution or torture, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. And it can, in political and social debate, serve to dehumanize asylum seekers and really lead to adding to stigmatization and misunderstandings of the nature of flight and the position of refugees and asylum seekers. Notions of bogus asylum seekers who've moved from one place to another or are seeking to come to certain countries in order to have a better life. So in our papers, we seek to analyze a number of different categories of so-called externalization practicing. We look particularly at extraterritorial processing in a third country or other place. And in this regard, the new Danish legislative proposal, which of course has not yet been established and indeed has not yet been the subject of any agreement that we know of with any particular state, which clearly, based on the text of the draft law, envisages the transfer of people to other countries where they will be processed, where their asylum claims will be processed. This falls within this category. But this is also what we see with Australia's transfers to Papua New Guinea and Nauru for processing, and in the past ideas and indeed some efforts to process people aboard ships in international waters. A second category is unilateral measures to prevent arrivals or to preclude access to asylum. And this includes, amongst other things, proposals such as the Hungarian embassy procedure I just mentioned now, interception in international waters and return of asylum seekers or refugees to face human rights violations, the case that we saw, of course, in the Hirsi case, for example, and other forms of summary denial by a state of asylum seekers seeking to enter the territory and return to face danger. And then thirdly, we can have cooperative measures to prevent arrival, which would include, for example, amongst other things, search and rescue cooperation arrangements where these do not permit or provide for disembarkation in a safe place. I would also venture to say that this can also be applied to many other situations of pushbacks at sea and land and other borders. However, having set out there what externalization is and why are some of the reasons why it's highly problematic, we also seek in UNHCR's document to make clear what externalization is not. And this is important because it's not going to be helpful for us to use this term as an umbrella word to cover all types of bilateral or multilateral engagements or cooperations between states that have a link to asylum. Because some of these forms of cooperation are arguably positive and indeed perhaps even necessary in light of what international law stipulates. And so that's why we think it's extremely important to draw very clear lines between what is permissible and potentially to be encouraged on the part of states and regional actors and what is not. So what we highlight is that there can, in some circumstances, be lawful practices involving transfer of responsibility for international protection, where these are undertaken in accordance with international standards. And UNHCR actually produced a paper in 2013 that talks about what these bilateral or multilateral cooperative arrangements would need to have in place in order to be lawful. So amongst the examples that could be envisaged, and some of these are theoretical rather than real, a correct application of safe third country concepts where they result in somebody genuinely having access to asylum in another country with which they have a link, regional disembarkation mechanisms. And here, the best example is still on paper. It's the UNHCR IOM proposal for a regional mechanism for the Mediterranean that hasn't been taken up by North African countries in the EU to date, but we are still working on it. It's arrangements for emergency or humanitarian evacuation or transfers. And this is a mechanism that UNHCR frequently uses where people are in danger in a first country of asylum and where they need to be evacuated, even if we haven't yet got a definitive resettlement arrangement for them, where they're admitted to another country for the purposes of safety or access to medical care or otherwise. And so what we underline is that where such arrangements are regulated and implemented, not only in line with the letter of the law, but also in the spirit of international cooperation and responsibility sharing as opposed to burden shifting, that these can be arrangements which can allow for respect for rights. We also highlight there's other things which involve transfer that are not unlawful externalization, such as resettlement, humanitarian admission, complementary and regular pathways, for example, which actually, from the viewpoint of the Global Compact and general protection policy, are essential pathways and avenues that need to be increased in order to further responsibility sharing and access to solutions for refugees. So, sorry, trying to move on. Okay, so we also highlight in the paper, and this is perhaps more relevant to our discussion today, that provision of humanitarian assistance to support countries who are hosting refugees in and of itself does not constitute externalization, and that capacity building support to the development of asylum systems, legal frameworks, institutions, and other things is also not per se unlawful. But it's important, and we've stipulated this in many of our public dispositions over the years, that these need to be complementary to and not in substitution for access to asylum in the country that is providing such assistance or support, or the region for that matter. We also highlight that some things that could otherwise be lawful may come to constitute externalization and be unlawful if they lack safeguards that can ensure that people's rights are going to be respected, or if they amount to responsibility sharing. So we then go on to highlight a number of key parameters that need to govern such relationships and arrangements in our view. We highlight first and foremost that actually international cooperation needs to be a part of the international refugee protection regime. Paragraph 4 of the preamble to the 1951 convention recognizes that international cooperation is essential to deal with a problem which is international in its very nature. The Global Compact on Refugees, of course, calls for more cooperation in the spirit of responsibility sharing. And we highlight that states may and indeed need to ensure that to cooperate to make this possible, provided that this is in line with responsibility sharing goals and that it can ensure, as the convention requires, the widest possible exercise of fundamental rights and freedoms. And we underline that states need to fulfill their obligations in good faith, not just in the letter of the law, but also its spirit, and that it's not possible for states to avoid their obligations by transferring elsewhere. I've there got a set of other additional parameters that need to govern such arrangement that UNHCR has set out there, which we think provides a good basis for dialogue about what can and can't be done. I won't go into detail in those as I want to make sure that we have enough time for questions and for further discussion. Perhaps before I conclude, however, I'd like to pick up on a couple of some of the really important and interesting points that I think that both Tamiras and Federica have highlighted. I think one of these is Federica's point about the transit country label. And I fully agree with Federica in that regard, that this is an unhelpful characterization in many respects, because first of all countries, or most countries at one level are transit countries. Serbia for Hungary, Hungary for Austria, France to the UK, Germany to Sweden. And so there's no such thing as a transit country category that includes countries from one region and not another. And the problem with its usage is this term is sometimes used in a way which suggests that transit countries have some kind of differential and lesser obligations towards the people in their territory, which of course is not at all the case, because all states owe obligations directly to refugees, even non-contracting parties to the 1951 Convention, which are bound by the customary international norm of non-refoulement and their human rights obligations. And so from UNHCR's perspective, it's very clear that all states should be working to strengthen their capacity to protect refugees and provide solutions. And this is, of course, crucial in the discussion of externalization, because it's an objective need, and the reality is that that will require resources. And so therefore, we also need to be looking at ways in which we can encourage those states which receive less refugees at their borders, but who have greater resources to support the development of the international protection system globally and large host countries in particular, to ensure that they can continue to do that and that they are actually encouraged to do that in a way that does bring about outcomes in line with rights and durable solutions. I think the point that was made also about motivations, I think that was a very interesting point too, Federica. It was Sandra, in fact, that you said that, of course, in the Western countries, political motivations in part contributed to what we saw as the advances of the protection systems in the 20th century, the Cold War in particular. I think this is very clear. There are states are driven in many cases by what they perceive as their self-interest. And I think, many European countries are quite open about their migration control objectives. This I think is not a secret, and not in EU documents either. But the question is, I suppose, if this can be harnessed in a way that brings about productive outcomes, if states that want to manage migration and arrivals better can be encouraged to nonetheless engage in arrangements that respect law and which actually promote rather than undermine protection in other countries, then this actually has to be a desirable goal for us. I'll leave it there. I'm looking forward to the discussion, and really thanks again for the opportunity to be with you today. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Madeleine, as well, for this excellent continuation of the discussion and bringing in the global and UNHCR perspective. We will have a Q&A on the panel, and then we will address the questions that come in the chat. So don't hesitate to add questions to the chat. We are collecting them and we'll address them in a minute. So from Madeleine's talk, I think I would like to hold on two important points. One is that many practices that are referred to as externalization, actually, these are different things, and some policies are more in the context of responsibility sharing and capacity building, sharing of experiences, sharing of resources, and so on. While others are more really in the sense of responsibility shifting and closing their own borders and their own access to asylum. And the difficulty is that these different policies take place in parallel, but not always in connection, right? The same actor can be involved in capacity building and supportive responsibility sharing on the one hand, while on the other hand, also closing access to its own asylum system. And the EU is very much trapped into this kind of hypocrisy, probably, that on the one hand, it wants to position itself as a global actor, also in line with the global compacts on migration and on refugees, and wants to positively shape these new mechanisms for international cooperation and responsibility sharing. But on the other hand, it is limited by what its member states are ready to do. And you also mentioned these legislative developments in several EU member states that very openly are not in line with international law. So how to bring coherence in is probably a major challenge. And the other point that you highlighted very well is that it does not make sense from UNHCR's perspective to differentiate between first countries of asylum, transit countries, destination countries, because all countries share the responsibility. It's a global public good, if we want. The only definitional issue that still is in the refugee law is that the border must have been crossed of the place where the person is persecuted, right? We would not say that the country of origin is an actor of refugee protection yet, but there are also some developments into this direction with the notion of safe havens and well, also some concrete measures that have been put place in Syria, for example. So holding this point in mind, what gets lost with this vision of globally shared responsibility is the agency of the refugee, isn't it? I mean, we go away from the idea that the refugees can choose their destination and accept the fact that the first goal is to grant protection, and this is irrespective of the place. So to make this story short, my two questions would be to you. Firstly, where do you see the balance between unlawful externalization, as Madeleine called it, and contribution to some kind, to fostering international cooperation and international responsibility sharing in the spirit of the global compacts in the cases that you analyze, Tamiras and Federica? And secondly, and this is maybe a bit more also for Madeleine, is it correct that we must think about the international refugee regime less in terms of an asylum, the spontaneous system of asylum, where the asylum seeker also had the possibility to choose the destination, if not de jure, then at least de facto. This may be one of the biggest transformations of the system as it has been put in practice in the 20th century. It's not a formal right of the refugee to choose the place of destination, but de facto, because we didn't have any meaningful international cooperation apart from the resettlement schemes, de facto it was the case that they more or less could choose where to go. And Dublin has changed it for Europe and so on, but slowly it seems to be really given away, this notion. Yes, so who would like to start on perhaps the first question on lawful versus unlawful externalization? Tamiras, you also had a bit, I think, of this notion in your talk.
Yeah, thank you, Sandra. I'm just going to be brief about it, I guess, building on the brilliant presentation of Madeleine in which she tried to define what externalization is and what it's not. I actually agree with her totally that externalization has suffered from conceptual stretching to the extent that we can no longer locate it. And what is meant by externalization is also cooperation, externalization, and when can we, for instance, delineate the boundaries between responsibility sharing and responsibility shifting when it comes to, for instance, like more affluent states in the global north dispensing financial aid, or for instance, Gulf states, dispensing financial aid to Syria's neighboring countries in the context of large-scale displacement. So the boundaries are very thin here, and they can become very shifty. So it's very much of a dangerous terrain to slip in. So what I wanted to say is that, unfortunately, the term externalization, as we know in literature, has acquired a derogatory dimension, in the sense that whenever scholars talk about externalization, they are talking about responsibility shifting, or how, for instance, the EU seeks to find solutions for refugees within the region, however, while governing from a distance or at a distance. Yet, I mean, we need to distinguish two pathways here, because with the emergence of the GCR and GCM, we have seen a proliferation of engagements, a lot of deliberative debates emerging, for instance, between the UNHCR, the EU, and also civil society actors and local actors within the region. So what I wanted also to kind of leave in this seminar, the possibility for us to talk about the positive aspects of collaboration in this regard, because from my field research, some local actors and civil society activists have told me that never before have we seen so many pathways for collaboration, for voicing, our opinions, or for contributing to what's happening. For instance, I am part of the UN displacement network in the Middle East, and we try as academics, civil society actors, to come together and to liaise, with others in order to try to impact the conversation. So while I wanted to caution against, the conceptual stretching of externalization, I wanted also at the same time, the seminar, to talk about the positive spillovers of deliberative collaboration and how we can further this, how can we make it more deliberative? How can we include more voices? To what extent external collaboration could also allow for a reflexive governance, in the sense that, for instance, in my presentation, the EU and Middle East and North African governments could come together and actually reflect on pathways to improve the compacts and the policy templates, and see how the experiences that have been accumulated since 2011 leave also room for improvements and for positive experiences.
It's very good. Federica?
Yeah, no, only very briefly. No, I think that honestly there are positive outcomes of not really related to the externalization of EU border control, but from the Moroccan point of view, I mean, this policy shift and this shift of paradigm of thinking Morocco as a country of immigration, it is a positive development. Now, to which extent this is translated into the real life of migrants there, this is another question, but we can't not deny the fact that this is a positive development. The regularizations, also from the point of view of racism, discrimination, which are problems that obviously still exist. But I think all this goes at least in a different direction than the securitarian restrictive start. And again, on this concept of externalization, I'd like to stress how in the field of migration and border control in particular, not to contribute to further concept stretching, but the point, taking into account also the fact that externalization means involvement of non-state actors as well. And I think this is something that should be taken into account. Non-state actors that include IOs or not-for-profit, for-profit organizations, which really have a key role. I've had since the beginning a key role in migration border control policy diffusion. And on this, I mean, there's a lot more to say about this. It's really a topic in itself. Yeah, I don't know if I should. Maybe I should stop here and open to the to the question.
I would have an immediate follow-up question, but perhaps we take first Madeleine and then have a second round on this topic.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Sandra. No, very good questions. But perhaps I should just clarify too. First of all, with its definition, UNHCR has tried to adopt an approach to the term externalization, which refers to impermissible and unlawful practices involving failure to treat people in accordance with their rights, lack of adequate safeguards, and potentially responsibility shifting rather than sharing. We then say that there are other practices that are lawful that we do not refer to as externalization, because we think indeed otherwise the concept becomes too difficult and debate gets confused. I think for us, really, the key question, however, needs to be looking at a range of problematic as well as less problematic practices. What the question for us as HCR in particular is, what do we want to change? What has to change about all of this? We don't presumably want to stop states from interacting, the EU with neighbours and partners altogether. We certainly don't want to stop the provision of humanitarian aid and assistance, and not capacity building aid where that brings about fruitful and positive outcomes. But we do want to address the negative effects, notably the risk of undermining of access to asylum and to solutions and to human rights wherever it occurs, and to promote rather the strengthening of capacity on the part of states to ensure treatment for refugees in line with their rights and for solutions. So, for example, I think as Tamiras's research has shown us, the compacts in Jordan and Lebanon have failed to lead to really sustainable integration options for Syrian refugees. Then I guess we need to think what needs to be done about that. We need to try and encourage Jordan and Lebanon, and to encourage the EU to also encourage Jordan and Lebanon to make those possibilities real for Syrians, not because all Syrians should stay in those countries, not because those countries need to absorb them, but because refugees who have agency, as you've said, Sandra, should have an opportunity, if their lives are in a country which has given them protection, if that's where they have settled, where they're making a contribution, this should also be something that is open to them. In the same way that we hope ultimately there will be conditions in place in Syria for truly voluntary return, which is certainly not the case now, and it's not going to be in the foreseeable future. So, we need to challenge externalization, but we also need to be thinking about what do we want to then send as the message about what needs to be done instead. And this is often the really challenging point. On your question about transformation of the system, Sandra, on that one, perhaps I'd raise a question about really whether we've seen such a significant shift towards externalization from the past. I'm not sure that we ever saw a situation at which refugees were accorded a free right to choose their countries of asylum. It's certainly never been something that has been part of international law. And of course, before we had Dublin in place, what we had was refugees in orbit who were being denied entry to various states and were trying to find places where they could enter. We had refugees in Africa, certainly in the post-colonial period, who just didn't have the means to travel. So what has changed is that we have indeed seen over recent decades more barriers to entry, visa requirements, carrier sanctions, etc. But we've also seen the rise of people smugglers and traffickers. So what we have are a lot more people who are undertaking dangerous journeys. And this is something which we obviously don't want to encourage. To the extent to which we can find safer, better alternatives to dangerous journeys, this has to be a key policy goal. And that means, in the first place, trying to argue that states make available more safe and legal pathways, rather than seeking to contain people in countries where their rights are not being respected and where they have no prospects of solutions. But we also need to be looking at ways to ensure that some of them at least can find solutions in their regions of origin or in the first countries of asylum to which they've come. And this, I think, is in many ways our real challenge right now within the framework of the Global Compact, which aims to a large extent to bring states together to try and facilitate both of those goals. Thank you.
Right, indeed, a challenge to have a regularized system to allocate people to protection is maybe very complicated, but we have unfortunately limited time, and I would like to take some of the questions from the chat. Some questions are more specific to the cases of Morocco and Jordan and Lebanon. Some are more general, and I would take the more general first. For Tamiras, Martin Fink asked what you understand under reverse diffusion and whether you could bring some examples. And a similar question is by Lorenzo Piccoli, whether reversals of policy, so change of policy, can be allocated to geopolitical calculations, or what determines such reversals. I think he had the case of Morocco in mind. So Tamiras and then Federica.
Yeah, thanks for this great question. Actually, so when we talk about reverse diffusion, this has to do with the fact that it's not only the EU that's diffusing norms to its neighbors, but sometimes we have the neighbors actually co-opting the EU into certain practices. For instance, when we talk about socialization, let's say the EU elite socializing with local governments. So research has shown, for instance, that local governments also change the way the EU, does politics with these people. So in the sense that the EU, for instance, tries to emulate the way local governments do politics in order to reach certain outcomes. So here we talk about socialization rather than, for instance, forward diffusion from the EU to local governments. Secondly, many scholars such as Jean-Pierre Casalino have looked at how, the norms that are diffused from the EU to its neighborhood lead to, reversal processes whereby they actually help those regimes in surviving. And where these, regimes start drawing on their cooperation with the EU and the financial aid and the legitimacy they get from the EU in order to survive and thrive and to convince, public spheres that they are indeed, the solution for livelihoods, for citizens' livelihoods, and for refugees' livelihoods. So here I would really call for actually factoring in how refugee politics, geopolitics, and domestic politics of these local governments converge together in order to create those interactive dynamics where norms travel, in curvilinear relationships and interactive push and pull dynamics rather than through forward pathways where the EU is promoting certain ways of doing things.
Thanks. And Federica, could you comment a bit on the conditions under which you see policy reversal happening?
Yeah. I think this is absolutely possible, and the example of Morocco demonstrate that the policy change towards immigration law, the shift from basically border policing and border control to immigration policy making. So shifting the focus from having to block migrants from departing or arriving to actually accepting the fact that migrants are there and there is an integration policies to put into place. And so this is due to geopolitical calculation. So I mean, yes, it is something that can always happen. And also what happened in Ceuta, the recent event that I took as an example, that is connected to the issue with between Spain and the Moroccan and Western Sahara struggle, is also connected. Some students of Morocco, and in particular, have connected that also to the fact that Trump supported Morocco towards its position of not recognizing the Western Sahara. So it is part of more maybe broader geopolitical calculations, and so yes, absolutely. I think that all these events actually demonstrate that. Now, if for the second part of the question, that if this can apply, there's the question about if this can be done in a symmetric way, even if Morocco and EU can act in the same way. No, because there are asymmetric power relations. That is something that we can't forget. So yes, leverage of Morocco, and an example that is linked also to the previous question about reversal diffusion is the negotiations of the readmission agreement between Morocco and the EU, in which actually Morocco shaped the readmission agreement and used that. It took very long for signing it, because it used that as a tool for the negotiations of other issues, and so there we can really study the mechanism of this reversal diffusion.
I would like to take two more questions from the chat, which are more specific for the cases. For the case of Morocco, there was a question about, well, this access to healthcare, how it works in practice, but also from the same person then, more generally also for UNHCR with regard to transit countries, whether UNHCR has guidelines for countries of disappropriate high transit. So I think the person had countries such as Morocco in mind, but I'm not sure. Anyways, countries which would be particularly prominent for transit migration, even if we don't like this categorization, and whether this notion of transit country exists all in UNHCR guidelines, or whether UNHCR has some recommendations for countries of transit migration. And another question was regarding the compacts, also in Lebanon and Jordan, that these have not worked very well, but there may be more successful cases. And the person was mentioning Niger, whether Niger would be an example for a successful case. So I revert the question to you. And maybe Madeleine, you start with the transit migration question.
Yes, certainly. No, thank you for that question. I think I can say that there is a specific document that aims to deal with the situation of transit countries, and that would be the Global Compact on Refugees, which alongside the New York Declaration and indeed the Global Compact on Migration, of course, are specifically looking at situations of large-scale arrivals, and that these are acknowledging that these can happen in many different regions of the world, and including in countries that perhaps have less capacity to deal with that. It doesn't distinguish, there is no distinction in the New York Declaration or the compacts between countries that might be along transit routes or otherwise, because indeed the needs are the same. These countries need to be encouraged to put in place, with international support and cooperation, systems to be able to receive people, to address specific needs, to identify international protection needs where relevant, and to work towards solution. And that will in some cases include resettlement and other third country solutions also as part of that. So, I mean, I think this is really what we are working on in many parts of the world that are characterized as transit regions. We're seeking to help those countries to manage the arrival of people in ways that don't impact adversely on host communities, and that's also, of course, a key element from the compact. But we're also trying to encourage those states to take on their responsibilities with international support where that's needed. There's other technical guidance that we have out there on the application of safe third country and first country of asylum principles, which in many respects relate specifically to countries through which people may have traveled before applying for asylum elsewhere. But this is more in terms of legal guidance that might also be of interest. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll take on the question about the medical assistance and the health service in Morocco. The fact is that there has always been this regulation from 2011 saying that whoever foreigner in Morocco, no matter the status, the legal status, could access basic health care. And then after that, so after 2013, now I don't remember very exactly the year, but should be 2016, 17, there is this regulation saying that regularized migrants, including refugees, they can apply for the medical assistance program. So basically having the card that allows to have access also to secondary and tertiary medical care, because the basic medical care, okay, more or less is covered, but the point is when it comes, so be like any other Moroccan. So this is the implementation of this regulation is not clear in the sense that it's not, de facto is not working. There's also an issue of budget but also, I mean, in Europe, we know very well this narrative about foreigners taking the welfare system, the health benefits. So it could be, here I'm making hypotheses because I haven't done this kind of research, but it could also be that the access, the day-to-day access to the healthcare is submitted to some people thinking that healthcare should be for the nationals. So that's something that, I mean, it's not only something that happens, can happen in Morocco, but it's something that happens in many countries, especially in Europe. So this is the problem about, so the regulation exists, but in practice it doesn't exist. And so it's the access to all kind of medical care.
Okay. Then the question about the compacts in the case of Niger, whether this
yes,
is more successful.
Just a few. Thank you. Thanks, Sandra. Just a few words on the compacts. So as I read in the chat, many asked questions about the compacts. So indeed, I mean, when we want to study the effect of the compacts on various countries, we need to study variation in the way these countries have responded and have interacted with the compact. So we cannot generalize experiences. It's very important to study the contextual requisites and how each host government has interacted with the EU. From this perspective, we cannot generalize. However, as far as I know, for instance, although the Jordanian and the Ethiopian job compacts, for instance, have allowed refugees to work, what the main criticism is that this is not associated with decent work and sustainable legal remedies. So what has happened is that the EU has focused on numerical targets, for instance, 200,000 or 100,000 work permits in the case of Ethiopia and 200,000 in the case of Jordan. However, at the end of the day, what we should focus on catalyzing, or creating a sustainable legal environment for those refugees to prosper and to strive and to be able to live decently in the context of such a constellation. However, when it comes to Niger, this hasn't been my empirical focus, but I should say that research has been very much double-edged on the partnership between EU and Niger, especially when it comes to Niger becoming like a EU-financed migrant hub, and how also this cooperation has created a system of containment for refugees and migrants, and how also the funding power of the EU hasn't really trickled on the ground to citizens' lives. So I guess we need like a more nuanced understanding of these partnerships and how they interact with contextual requisites, but also how they transform people's lives on the ground, as also Federica emphasized, that we cannot look at externalization without tracking the pathways whereby at the end they end up transforming people's lives and reaching non-resilient outcomes or outputs. In this regard, as the Lebanon and the Jordan compacts show. So I'll stop here, I guess, and yeah.
I think there's one more question that I would like to raise from the chat, although we are a bit over time, and this is the one of refugee skill development and whether investing into the skill development of refugees is not a sustainable or let's say a type of support that is helpful in these contexts we are talking about. And indeed, this notion of refugee empowerment, of self-reliance, is very present also in the refugee compact. So perhaps this could be our last question into the round, and we could start with Tamiras and Federica for their understanding how this notion of empowerment of refugee for skill development, for more self-reliance has worked in their cases. And then also hear Madeleine from the UNHCR perspective, because this is quite prominent indeed in the Global Refugee Compact, and how you interpret this vision. Tamiras, perhaps?
Yes, very briefly. So on refugee self-reliance and refugee resilience, of course, we shouldn't undermine refugee skills and their ability to contribute to the labor markets. And I mean, as many studies have shown, however, the problem is that when we are dealing with refugee adverse or refugee or host governments that are inimical to, or that are very much against the integration of refugees in the labor market, we end up having scenarios of cosmetic change whereby there are some empowerment initiatives, some self-reliance initiatives. However, they do not really trickle down to improving the general protection environment that allows refugees to have sustainable work opportunities. For instance, there are certain recent studies that have shown that in Lebanon, international actors have put in place, a lot of self-reliance initiatives. However, the fact that the Lebanese government has been very much against the integration, the formal integration of Syrian refugees into the labor market, gains have been really minimal. And all the talk, in the 2016 London conference about job creation in Lebanon, both for refugees and host populations, has been really just, a letter of intent more than actual implementation on the ground. So while, I guess the discourse on self-reliance should be furthered, I think it should be coupled also with a serious discussion on protection mechanisms and how this discourse actually interacts with refugee policies of both host governments, but also of governments that wish to promote such self-reliance initiatives.
No, I think this is a really important question, and it's a very, very key issue here. From the case of Morocco, this connects highly with the donors, aids, the NGOs, all the organizations that provide training. So all these actors and organizations that are around this actual implementation of policies of integration, and all this really goes in the direction of the Global Compact's objectives. And it's all about, it's important to stress that it's all about the integration in the job market through trainings for self-employment and marketable jobs, so jobs that respond to the markets. I was reading some research saying that in the case of Morocco, many actors of NGOs that provide this kind of training actually say that there is too much focus on certain jobs, always the same jobs, and so that it's impossible then that all these people do these jobs. In general, this is understood as a neoliberal approach and view of refugees, policies of refugees. But this is key, I think, this idea of self-reliance, and so also developing the skills and all this. It's really, really a key issue, and probably in every context that we study.
May I just add one point on this just issue very briefly? Also, I mean, just empirical research, for instance, in Turkey and in Lebanon and in Jordan has shown that refugee self-reliance initiatives have been twinned with, project-based and donor-based projects. So whenever they ended, actually refugees didn't have anything else to do, or they didn't see a future in what they were doing. And they criticized actually such entrepreneurial projects because they were disconnected, from their prospects for the future. So this is just, the kind of like disconnect or unclear relationship between refugee self-reliance, but also future aspirations and future options in a dignified setting.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm very conscious that our participants have been patient with us, and we don't want to take long. Just to say that, however, that I could fully agree that access to the means to develop skills and to strengthen skills is absolutely crucial. And this, of course, is one of the 4 central objectives of the Global Compact on Refugees. And it's in recognition of the fact they have enormous potential to contribute to their host communities. Also that giving people access to the means to work is in reflecting their human dignity. It also, I think, is shown to be particularly crucial when we bear in mind the fact that the majority of the world's population is today in protracted refugee situations, meaning that 25,000 or more people have been displaced for 5 years or more. And that, of course, includes much of the Syrian refugee population, amongst many others. So people can't afford to be just left idle for years on end. And that's one of the reasons why, in addition to self-reliance, also education has become a major focus for HCR and its partners. And I think, bearing in mind that there will be many academics who are on the line, I think whatever we can do to research and to showcase empirical evidence that highlights the benefits of giving refugees access to the means to self-reliance to their host communities and economies will be an important contribution to all of this. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much. I think this was a very rich and multifaceted discussion of a huge topic. Many issues could be discussed further, but I guess it's time to dissolve this webinar. We thank you, Tamiras, Federica, Madeleine, very, very much for coming and for also preparing so instructive and challenging contributions, also for the discussion. And we thank, of course, the audience out there who unfortunately we cannot see, but we have received some questions in the chat. And anyways, we are sure that there will be more on these questions to be researched in coming years, and hopefully also improved policies being developed. So yes, it's time to say bye-bye. Thank you so much. And
thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.